Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Good to see you. We're here once again with another episode of Revisiting the Road to Serfdom. Kevin of Engineering Politics and myself, Truman of Return to Reason, doing our chapter by chapter analysis. And now we've just been kind of diving into it lately. And since we have a very jam-packed outline here, I think we should probably spend a lot of time talking about informalities. So what are you drinking, Kevin? What do you got going on there?
I have a Bloody Mary. So it's like a Midwestern Bloody Mary. I don't know. I know you said you put different stuff in yours, but my Bloody Mary is Bloody Mary Mix, which is a particular one. I have Jimmy Loves, it's called. It's my favorite one. A little bit of Worcestershire sauce, if I pronounced that correctly. And a splash of pickle juice is actually amazing. Amazing. And a Bloody Mary. And then Tito's vodka.
There you go. Ice. Nice. That's good. You don't do any Tabasco or anything?
This mix is kind of spicy. Normally I like it super spicy, but I also don't want to get a dry mouth or dry lips during this conversation because I care about the quality of our conversation as well as I care about getting licked up. I'm like
licked up or liquored up. Those are very different things.
No, what's his name? Officer from Trailer Park Boys.
Oh
no, I am the liquor.
Oh, perfect. Well, I have an Irish coffee here. I have some Irish cream, a little bit of Jameson. I put a splash of honey whiskey in it, and some espresso. And so since I have other stuff to do today after this is going to be the only one that I have here. So last time we talked about Chapter 9, Security and Freedom. Kevin, you want to give the folks at home a summary of what that chapter was about? My guess is it probably had something to do with both security and the tension that might have with freedom, but you fill in the gaps.
You are correct, sir. Man, you're spot on today. But yeah, so the simple breakdown that I have here today is the first thing that we came across in the chapter is that there is a difference between limited security and absolute security. Now, Hayek argues that there's a difference in these matters, and I'm sure that, as we went through the conversation last time, which was episode 8, you guys can listen to it and you guys can understand that we actually kind of disagree with Hayek here. And this is really the first time that we disagree with him in any significant way, but that most of our disagreements with him come because he wrote this book in 1944. We are in 2021 now, and I think he changed his mind on some of these things, at least how he views them. And I think we're going to go over a little bit of how that can change today as well. But he argues there's a difference between giving limited security and absolute security. Limited, just meaning you get security in some spaces. Absolute means the state effectively controls everything. He understands absolute is bad. Limited can be good in limited spaces, but the problem is there's no really good, hard limiting principle there. And so that always constantly expands. There's really no way to actually limit that limited security. So I think if he were around today and saw some of the things we've been doing lately, he would probably agree with us. And so I think, that's a
you see him shift a little bit in the stuff he started writing in the 70s also, I think, on that about bureaucracy.
Well, even his introduction and new prefaces coming up, he's already said stuff he's got wrong. Like in the book, he does criticize the Soviet Union, but he didn't realize the Soviet Union would become a bigger monster than Germany. And then China, coming after that. So, you're a writer of your time. The advantage of writing a book is you get all your ideas thoroughly out there. The disadvantage of writing a book is it's a snapshot in time and you don't get to provide much commentary after it. The second thing that we went over is, I think it's a direct quote from the book: as the privilege of security consistently increases, the demand for it becomes more and more urgent until, in the end, no price, not even that of liberty, appears too high. We related this a lot to the COVID restrictions because it just perfectly relates to it now. But basically, when you institute these policies or implement these policies that provide all the security, you start to get this change in society that they recognize this security as a right, and by that right they want more of it, and now security goes ahead of freedom, and now people don't even think about freedom anymore. They just think this security is my right. Healthcare is my right, food is my right, housing is my right. This is how we completely forget about security, and this is how liberal democracies like ours turn into tyrannies and authoritarian tyrannies because of all the security provided by the state.
Yep, and part of that is that they can't. If you have a society where let's say you can choose between only a little bit of freedom or only a little bit of security, so if you have like a lot of freedom but you don't have a lot of like financial security or whatever, or you have a lot of that security, but you don't have very much freedom. In the one where you have a lot of freedom, you can leverage that for more freedom and more security. So you can leverage what little bit of freedom you have to get more like economic security, whatever. So I'm talking about specifically if someone's like really poor, but they're in a free society. But if you're in a society where you have no freedom and you have all this government implemented security, you can't leverage that to get more freedom. It's an asymmetry because it's all granted to you. And so you would obviously want to be in the society where, you might be super poor, or you might be less well off. But as long as you can leverage freedom to get more, security or privileges or whatever, that's far more ideal than the other one.
And it just shows you that as a currency, if you will, freedom holds value and security doesn't. And I think it's an important way to look at it. That kind of transition to the third and final bullet point from last chapter, which is trading in freedom for security, changes how we get information about the wants and needs of society. The way we do it in a free market, liberal democracy is by the price mechanism. We understand it's a transfer of information there. We understand prices go up and down depending on the needs and wants and availability. But when you switch to the other system, you replace that with the power of rank and status, is what he calls it in the system, that you no longer can better your position by making a better product for someone else, but you better your position by really sucking up the state and gaining position in the state that can only be granted to you by the state. And this creates a real privilege and returns us to a time before economic freedom, not after it, which is why he says economic freedom is a prerequisite for all these other freedoms. And then Hayek ultimately agrees that the cost of absolute security is our absolute freedom resulting in tyranny.
Yep. Yeah. And so that brings us up to, tyranny. Why do the worst get on top? That's the name of chapter 10, which is where we are today. And this chapter, we kind of wanted to set the stage for exactly what the tension is here. Again, Hayek, I think all of these chapters seem to be just a compare and contrast kind of thing. And I think one of the things that it tends to be arguing in this chapter is the difference between, like the goals of something and the outcomes of something. And we'll get into exactly what that means about the moral basis and the moral results of it. But the whole chapter made me think of this thought experiment that John Rawls has. It's called original position. And original position is basically this, again, it's a thought experiment where you say, okay, if I was going to create a society or the framework of a society that includes its government and all its systems, whatever, and I don't know what position in that society I will occupy. And I also don't know what skin color I'll have or what my sex will be or anything like that. What type of society would I want to create? If, you create it and then you don't know who you'll be, what you'll be, or where in that society you'll be placed, what type of society will you create? And you'll want to create one that has a respect for the individual, where people who are at the bottom can move to the top, where they can, as I mentioned earlier, leverage that freedom to get, more wealth or more physical or whatever type of security, economic security. And the fundamental issue here is that Hayek is pointing out that this is a society like central planning, the concept of planning, which, hey, look, I remember this time. We got to define some words at the beginning. So planning is the thing that Hayek was writing about. But when you think planning, just think like a bureaucracy, top down, government control. Like basically the government runs everything. It's like Green New Deal. It's, everything is infrastructure, if you're going to look in contemporary context, but basically the government and some wise, philosopher king, moral betters run society for us and they plan it all out for us. Freedom is not a super important aspect of it. And the other one is liberal. Kevin, you want to just define liberal before I continue?
Yeah. Well, one thing when it comes to planning, when people think of planning, in the sense that he used it, that Hayek used it back then, it's kind of like, words like planning has gone on. You don't hear that much anymore. Socialism, you hear a lot more now. Communism, you hear a lot less of. But these things have evolved. And you actually showed me a pretty good video before of Ayanna Pressley, I think, saying some horrifying things about making racism a public health issue now. Yep. All that does is transfer the power from the people to a bureaucracy, and that is planning. That is
Yep.
the 21st century planning there, and that's what you got to focus on. So when we relate these ideas from Hayek's time to our time, that's how you can relate those two. Now, liberal, when he uses liberal in this book, he's talking about the 20th century, or at least 19th century European version of liberalism, which is the individual over the coercive power. They want to do anything they can to make sure that there's no coercive central authority that takes control of all the individuals. Now in America, and he even says it in 1944 that the term liberal has been completely reversed to mean the exact opposite, that the asking for more coercive power to fulfill the goals of the quote unquote liberals at the time. Now, I think today's progressives don't really go under the name of liberal, but certainly leading up to now, liberal has not meant what the way that Hayek is using it in this book. So just make sure to take note of that.
Yep. I always say think libertarian, think conservative, just something like traditional conservative, traditional libertarian kind of thing. So anyway, so the point that I bring up with Rawls's original position is Hayek says, he's saying, look, the type of system that the planners want to create is one that necessitates absolute power and control being at the top by the planner. The planner has to have the power to implement their plan, because people are not, you're not going to get 100% consensus or even a majority consensus for the plan. So they have to have the power to force their plan onto people. And there's no recourse for people at the bottom to try to oppose the plan. I mean, there just isn't. And we'll get into some of that here in a little bit. But the point is that if you were to take, John Rawls's thought experiment, you would absolutely not create this system. You would not create a system where it's like, I have no idea where I'm going to be, who's going to be in charge, what I'm going to look like, or anything like that. So I want to make a system where if I end up at the bottom, I have some freedom to not be at the bottom anymore. In a planned society, that doesn't exist. You're stuck there, or the means in which you could get to the top require, something that's basically morally reprehensible. And so the point is that, yeah, you would never want to create a society in which a small group or even one person had absolute power over the rest. And so Hayek actually opens the chapter with this quote by Lord Acton. I'm sure people are familiar with it. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so that's why this whole chapter, why do the worst get on top, is because this system creates this thing where it's like, okay, they think, well, we'll make it where it's run by decent people. It's going to be run by good people. It's going to be a dictatorship of the good. And Hayek is saying that's not how this works. That's not how this works. So we'll get into one of these first quotes here. We must not deceive ourselves into. Sorry, did you have something?
Yeah, I was gonna say, one sec, for everyone listening to this. I think it's important for every time we read through a quote or anything, keep asking yourself the question, why did the worst get on top? This is a brilliant breakdown that Hayek does as to why. Not at the beginning, you're going to ask yourself, why did the worst get on top? And at the end, you're going to ask yourself, how is there any other logical conclusion?
Yep.
So I think just keep asking yourself as we go through this. Sorry.
Yeah. Why is it that, they always say, that's the joke, communism's never been tried, real whatever's never been tried. It's like, yeah, it seems like every time it has been tried, the worst get on top. So why is that? Is that just happenstance, or is it a product of this particular system? So that's a good point, Kevin. So we must not deceive ourselves into believing that all good people must be Democrats or will necessarily wish to have a share in the government. Many, no doubt, would rather entrust it to somebody whom they think more competent. Totalitarianism is a powerful system alike for good and evil, and the purpose for which it will be used depends entirely on the dictators. And those who think that it is not the system which we need fear, but the danger it might be run by bad men, might be tempted to forestall this danger by seeing that it is established in time by good men. So the point is he's saying, yeah, people can look at it, like Lord of the Rings. Hey, the ring could be used for good, right? And there are some people who say, well, if only good people, if we had good dictators, if we had the philosopher kings, like Plato talks about, then it'd be totally fine because the people in charge would be good. And Hayek is saying, no. That's a naive belief. It's not the people who are in charge. It's the system that creates a mechanism where only bad people get on top. But anyway.
Yeah. I think too many people believe that it's not the system that's the problem. It's the good and bad people who are managing the system, or that any system can actually work if a good enough person were to manage it. And as Lord Acton says in that opening quote, he clearly disagrees with that statement. Communism didn't fail because it wasn't run by good men. Socialism hasn't failed repeatedly because it's not run by good men. It's a system itself which continues to concentrate coercive power that corrupts good men and attracts bad men. I think it does those two things that even well-intentioned people, this goes back to, Jordan Peterson talking about, like, if you read some of these, ideas and statements from, concentration camps and like stuff written by actually like Nazis, like you have to understand your own capacity for evil. We all have a capacity to do horrible, horrible things if we're told to believe something strong enough, or that this other group, something we'll get to later, this other group is evil, and you must do anything you can to shut them down. So I think it's really important to understand not only do bad people on top, this corrupts good people and turns them into bad people. And Hayek lays out this case throughout the chapter.
Yep.
Yeah, and then so we're going to get on to the next quote. Quote, the moral basis of collectivism has, of course, been much debated in the past, but what concerns us here is not its moral basis, but its moral results. Your motives here are irrelevant, basically. The usual discussion of the ethical aspects of collectivism refers to the question whether collectivism is demanded by existing moral convictions, or what moral convictions would be required if collectivism is to produce the hoped for results. Our question, however, is what moral views are likely to rule it. The interaction between morals and institutions may well have the effect that the ethics produced by collectivism will be altogether different from the moral ideas that led to the demand for collectivism. Basically, the demand for collectivist policies is strengthened by moral objections to injustices and equities that are created by the non-collectivist policies here. So an example of this today is wealth inequality. It's something you always hear. It's like, oh man, look at the richest are so rich, the poor are so poor. Why is the inequality there? We can have an argument if that's immoral or not. But the case by many of the collectivists and people who didn't even think of themselves collective, the everyday people who see this disparity is, why do we allow people to be generationally poor while you have the ultra rich in this country? So they argue for collectivist policies to fix the issue, but the results here and the results we've seen throughout history in every country that's tried this is it just creates a more poor people equally. Right? More poor people equally. And the moral basis doesn't match the moral results here, right? So if you think allowing people to be poor is immoral and the policies you implement result in more people being poor, but it's just more equal, well, those moral bases and those moral results do not match up.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, Thomas Sowell talks about this all the time of, people will label a program or a training or something like that. This is diversity training, or this is, there's another one. Racial sensitivity training. And he says, okay, you called it that, but we have no idea if that was the outcome just because you called it that. The name of the thing is not necessarily the outcome of the thing. And that's actually, it's funny. So in the Machiavellians, Barnum says the goal is not evidence of the goal. Because you can articulate a goal, that's not evidence that it's an attainable goal or that you're going to get there through your means that you proposed. So so again, why do good people get on top? I think that's a good question for people to be asking. And you have to get it in your mind, your intentions and your outcomes are not inherently the same thing. I've talked about this in education before, right? Where a teacher will be just miserable at their job, but they'll say, I care about kids and I love my job. And I just really, I just really care about these kids. And it's like parents with Munchausen's by proxy care about their kids, and then they kill them. And so it's like being able to articulate, a goal is not the same as actually implementing the goal.
And I think a good example here real quick
Sure.
of kind of the opposite is people like Ibram X. Kendi attack President Abraham Lincoln because he didn't believe that, according to his own writings and his own speeches, didn't seem to believe that white people and black people were the same. He didn't believe that they were equal, but his policies resulted in the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery. So, his argument is there, well, he's a bad person. His intentions were not as pure as we think they are now, but the results were still good, but we should still be mad at him. It's like, well, no, again, this is that asymmetry of the basis, maybe not the greatest moral basis, but the moral results. What ended up happening was obviously positive and obviously moral, and put us on the right path toward more freedom and more liberty. So, it can go in both directions. You can have good intentions with bad results. You can have bad intentions with good results. Now, obviously, we prefer you to have good intentions so we can keep having good results. But it does run both ways.
No, I think that's a really good observation. It's a really good observation. So now we'll transition. We're just kind of laying the stage of, this is one of those ones where I think we talked a little bit about, it might've been actually in the last chapter or the one before, I think it was maybe the one before it, about the breakdown of society once planning is put into place. And here he really gets into kind of the nuts and bolts of how like planning starts to coalesce and become like the dominant system, and how power makes its way to the top.
Yeah, that's chapter 8.
Yep. And so he says, in this stage, it is the general demand for quick and determined government action that is the dominant element in the situation. So in this stage, people are talking about planning. They're at a point in life, again, referencing chapter before this, where it's more about safety or government security, government mandated security, than freedom that has become the dominant goals and values. And, in the value hierarchy, it's at the top. So he's saying at this stage in a society, the general demand for quick and determined government action that is the dominant element in the situation. Dissatisfaction with the slow and cumbersome course of democratic procedure, which makes action for action's sake the goal. So I'm going to pause there, because he's referenced this multiple times, that people get to a point where they say, oh, that system that requires consensus, where we have to compromise and come to mutual agreement and understanding. People get to a point where they say, oh, that's just a hindrance. And we can't get stuff done. We can't get all these things done, right? Where have we seen this today? We can't get the things done we want to get. Let's get rid of the filibuster. And so it's action for action's sake becomes the goal. And it is the man or party who seems strong and resolute enough to get things done, get rid of the filibuster, for example, pack the court, who exercises the greatest appeal. Strong in this sense means not merely a numerical majority. It is the ineffectiveness of parliamentary majorities with which people are dissatisfied. So this is not about a majority. What they will seek is somebody with such solid support as to inspire confidence that he can carry out whatever he wants. Again, their willingness to be on board with the whatever they want is going to be, based on their rhetoric. And we're going to implement, anti-racism or some type of housing. We're going to government housing or monthly checks or something like that. But the point is that people become disillusioned with the parliamentary or democratic system that requires people to work together and coalesce with some kind of mutual understanding and compromise with each other. They say, no. We want to get things done. Let's get rid of those things. We just need a strong person in power, a strong group in power who will tell us what we want to hear, and they'll get things done for us. And so this is where you start to see, like, oh, what kind of person is going to occupy that space, or what kind of group is going to occupy that space?
Yeah. I think it's just another argument for, a more efficient government run by good people, because you have to have the good. I mean, that always assumes, good people. Like find it funny when the fans of Bernie want to implement his policies, but they don't, consider what happens when you implement his policies, build in that coercive power into the system, and then someone else who's the opposite of Bernie Sanders steps in and now has that same power. Because they always just assume, well, we're gonna win, we're gonna get the presidency, and then we'll never lose again. That's the idea. And very often that is the case for a lot of these governments who go to this large coercive power, is they know that that's going to be an issue. So what do? They shut down elections. They don't let people vote. They have 16-year terms or something ridiculous, and that's how that can devolve into tyranny. But I think an uneducated public clamors for more results, whereas a group thoroughly versed in the U.S. Constitution and founding principles results understands that this barrier to action that we're seeing here, which is really just the internal gridlock is a feature, not a bug of our system.
Yep.
This inability to move, this inability to push stuff forward is important, right? We are not a true democracy. This is not mob rule. People think, when they say things are moving too slow, it's democracy. Things should be moving faster because most people want it. It makes sense. Most people, once you get above that 50% number, then it should just become law instantaneously. That is a horrifying future that all of the founders were like, no, we don't want that. Not at all. They understood mob rule and how that can just evolve into tyranny immediately. And so I think having this coercive power is scary enough, but having an efficient coercive power is a nightmare. It is your nightmare. It's my nightmare. It's all of our nightmares. We do not want to live in that future.
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, I think I was telling you that I saw a op-ed in the New York Times the other day about they were right. I know. I'm sorry for your loss. Complaining about how we haven't had any new constitutional amendments for a long time, and how, I think it's no coincidence that, Kurt Vonnegut's classic short story, Harrison Bergeron, starts with it's like the 213th, 214th, and 215th amendments is what implemented all this equality and stuff. And it's like, whenever you just start passing all of this crap, this is where it gets really dangerous. And so I think, and again, to use what you said earlier, this works both ways. A system that values freedom and maximizes individual liberty and really tries to emphasize, if we're going to change, requires a lot of agreement, or it's going to be just all bogged up and there's not going to be action. It's going to be a very slow and cumbersome system. That's a feature, not a bug. And a system that does not give a crap about consensus and just gets things done, and pushes stuff through regardless of what, people think. That's a feature, not a bug of a totalitarian, or at least.
But why do the worst get on top?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe we'll get there.
Keep asking ourselves that.
Yeah. We're going to get there, right?
No.
I doubt it, sir. So anyway, once this system starts to get put into place, and once they have this, we've gotten rid of the parliamentary procedures and the democratic norms and the need for consensus and the need for agreement, doesn't take them long to realize. I mean, this is the whom chapter, right? Who plans whom? People realize, oh, that's a lot of power up there, and there's a scramble to try and form the fastest coalition or whatever you can to try and wield that power to get that government gun. And there's this quote here. He says, collectivism has no room for the wide humanitarianism of liberalism, but only the narrow particularism of the totalitarian. And so, we're going to flesh that out. But the point is that collectivism, despite having collective in the name, it cannot cater to the collective. It can only cater to a narrow and particular group, and which ends up being a totalitarian regime.
Yeah, he uses the word particularism a lot in this section. I don't know if I've even heard of that used that way before this, but it actually is quite brilliant when you expand out on what it means, the implications back in 1944, and now the implications now, which are kind of different, but they're really still the same. And this quote just tells me that liberty takes a back seat to the goals and aims of the totalitarian. Their priorities will change as soon as they get power. Your priorities are no longer their priorities. And even a good person, bad person, doesn't matter. Good person's in there, gets this coercive authority. They quickly understand it's I got to take some drastic steps to improve society, even, out of good intentions. And it's those drastic steps that takes away what we've talked about in previous chapters, your choice, your ability to live your life the way you want to. This is no longer a liberal society when that happens. And because they have to develop their own new hierarchy of ends, like we've talked about in previous conversations before this, when you build that rigid hierarchy, the definition of a rigid hierarchy that does not allow feedback into the system, your feedback is no longer irrelevant because they have their own goals and aims that they need to achieve at any means necessary.
Yep. Yeah. And it's not just that they have to abandon liberty, that liberty takes a backseat to their aims, but just basic morality ends up taking a backseat. One of the things you talked about earlier is that absolute power and this system, it corrupts good people, but it also repels good people. I mean, that's the quote that Hayek says. I think we have it right here. Socialism can only be put into practice by methods which most socialists disapprove. And earlier he says the planner will have to choose between a disregard of ordinary morals and failure. And whenever you're put in that system, it's going to either corrupt good people or repel those good people, which creates a vacuum. And that's what attracts the demagogues, the bad actors, the people who have no problem disregarding ordinary morals, in order to achieve their aims. And so, this is something that Michael Malice has talked about this, and how, a society can be changed fundamentally and actually in really substantive ways. And I think maybe we might have even talked about this last time. It doesn't require a majority, but just an organized minority against a disorganized majority. And so this is that scramble for power, scramble to control to be the who's planning whom. And in the course of that, people are trying to, one, they have to organize, right? So they have to form some kind of coalition with some other people to try and, we got to get some groundswell of support. And Hayek, I think, very astutely points out that it's the lowest common denominator which unites the largest number of people. So it's probably going to be something populist on the front end. It's because in order to appeal to the most amount of people, you have to have the most vague, you might use phrases like, I don't know if Hayek's mentioned this before, but like common good, or common welfare, or something like that. In order to appeal to them. And you'll have to appeal to the lowest common denominator of people. That's not like necessarily a negative thing. It's just a fact that's how you can build the broadest consensus. And that in order to get this particular group to coalesce around this common cause, you're probably going to have to create some kind of common enemy. And we're going to get to that here in a minute. But again, so we're laying the framework. People, so now we're in a society where security is more important than freedom. And in order for you to give out that security, you have to have a system that makes it really easy to get things done, action for the sake of action. So you get rid of the democratic norms, you get rid of these things. And then now we're concentrating power at the top. Once people realize what kind of system that is, there's a scramble for that power that's going to be a sorting mechanism. And when people realize what's required to execute that power, good people are either going to be corrupted or pushed out. Bad actors are going to fill that gap. And in order to build a group, a coalition, in order to fill that role efficiently, they're going to have to appeal to the lowest common denominator of people, and they're going to have to create some kind of in-group, out-group dynamic.
Yeah, I like the terms you introduced of the common welfare, the common good, also their common sense into there. These are red flags that everyone should hear and understand that if you have to implement those words, those terms, that means they aren't common. Because if they were common, they wouldn't have to mention it. They wouldn't have to highlight it. Common sense is never common sense if they have to tell you it's common sense, or you'd already know it.
It's a good point.
So that's just one of those red flags. And that's how you build a larger group, by convincing them this is in their best interest, and that it's like a really good salesman can sell really well when they convince the person they're selling to that it's their idea. That is how, someone who knows how to build a mass movement can convince a larger group to go behind the central idea. So these next quotes will go into the particularism stuff, which I think is really a profound observation in here that is more common. Again, it's a little bit different in 1944 than it is today, but it does relate today very, very neatly. So quote, "It may indeed be questioned whether anyone can realistically conceive of a collectivist program other than in the service of a limited group, whether collectivism can exist in any form other than that of some kind of particularism, be it nationalism, racialism, or classism," end quote. So this type of collectivist mass movement must have something, typically a grievance, which is something we hear a lot about today, right? To rally around, some central idea to rally around. This accomplishes the task of building a larger movement, typically at the expense of a victimized group. So when we talk about victimized groups, sometimes that group is singled out and attacked. Think about the Jews in Germany. That's a very obvious, or the landowners in the Soviet Union. And then sometimes that group is actually used to attack the ideological opponents of the collectivist movement. Think about race in America today, right? Race in America used to be an oppressed class, but now it's starting to get used as a privileged class to attack ideological opponents. This is how you can just call everyone else racism who doesn't agree with your rigid, typically collectivist policy. And that when he talks about racialism, nationalism, these were words that you associate with Germany, but it can also be associated with all of the different mass movement, collectivist mass movements through the years from Germany on to today, where we don't look at classism as much. Classism is not as ingrained in American history as it is in the European countries. But since racism is seen as the original sin, if you will, of America, that's the grievance they attach to build this huge group of people who care about race, the allies, right, to attack anyone who disagrees with their policies. If you are not sufficiently afraid of the sun monster, you're a racist. If you are not wearing a mask when you're told to wear a mask, you're a racist. If you're not getting a vaccine, you're a racist. They all relate it back to the central idea, and that's how they attack their ideological opponents.
So that might answer, some of the question that I had. Is just like, so, I mean, again, Hayek uses, one of the quotes, I think, at a different point, where he says that almost all collectivists end up being nationalists, like militant nationalists. But, again, he gives other examples of just a particularism. The point is that collectivism cannot actually cater or serve the collective. It can only serve a particular group. And so if with that framework in mind, and again, maybe you answered this, but like, what do you think is the particular groups of today? Like what are the in-group, out-group, in terms of, like, we have lots of in-group, out-group. There's in-group, out-group, notions on the right, on the left, and everywhere in between. But if we're going to look at what's the in-group, out-group dynamics of those who are seeking to implement this kind of system, like what are the particulars that you think that they're like, what are they coalescing around? Like, so that whom is, it's like who plans whom, right? But we could change it to what particular group is planning for the rest of the group, right?
Who oppresses whom?
Yeah,
basically right now. And I put that at an ideological level. Yeah.
Served. Yeah.
Yeah. So I used the example of racism there, but I don't think it starts and ends there. So we've talked about stuff, like wokeism. We talk a huge subsection of wokeism is the CRT type movement. And it's easy to simplify wokeism down to hate white people. That's not what it's about. That is an efficient way today to say I'm fighting the power, effectively, is how they're using it. So it's not necessarily, although they use the language of racism, that's not like the end goal. So really, I think it's an ideological battle, and that's where it's breaking down today. It's hard to say it's nationalist. You can say the reaction to it can sometimes be nationalist, but I think a note we had on here before is nationalism with globalism. And I know we don't really want to get into that, but I think the way that globalism is actually implemented today, is just a large scale nationalism. There's a quote toward the end of the book that we don't have in here, to the end of this chapter. I don't know if it's like Bernard Shaw said it, that it's like the whole world is going to be made up of a few nations, and the smaller nations are just going to have to crumble to the power or like be crushed. Yeah. And I think that's the vision of globalism today. It's like once a large, global power, really, anyone that wants to use coercive power, in the United States can take control. They're just going to crush any nation that doesn't agree with their ideas within the nation. But to answer your question, I think the in-group right now is anyone who believes, and I suppose you can just break down to these collectivist policies, old style socialism, old style coercive power. They're truly against liberty. And I think that's where it's breaking down. I know it's much more broad than breaking it down how Hayek broke it down. But, I think they use the means of racialism. Sometimes it means of classism, sometimes it means of nationalism, to create the in-group, out-group, right? Because the in-group is the people wearing the masks. You can easily identify the out-group by the ones not wearing the masks. There
Unless you're at Barack Obama's birthday party.
Yeah, for sure. Well, come on, you can't listen to that soothing voice with a mask on. Just be muffled. Wouldn't be able to hear him stutter his way through a sentence. But so we are seeing the in-group, out-group identifiers for sure. Masks is one, vaccines are one. Having a Black Lives Matter sticker versus an All Lives Matter sticker, or just not even having a sticker, proposing your ideological assumptions about race in America. We've talked about before, having an American flag in your front yard is sometimes a sign. Having an American flag, especially during election season, and you don't have a Joe Biden, sign to accompany it, it's assumed that you're in the out group now. It's assumed that you're probably one of those evil Trump supporters. So I think that's how we're breaking it down today.
Yeah, I think if we're going to say what group, now I think legislation is going to serve, I don't think it's just the race stuff. And I think you've addressed several of the other things. I want to make an updated list of what I think all the tenets of far left orthodoxy are, but it's got to be the rich need to pay their fair share. Racism is a problem in America today. Raise the minimum wage. We should be actively anti-racist. The unvaxxed are also the unwashed and lesser than. Wear masks even if you're vaccinated. Like, I think there's something there where it's assumed it's just, if my team is in charge, then I will take everything, the CDC, FDA, anything that they say as gospel. I don't know if you've seen the clips of that before the election, whenever you have like everyone from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris and all these Democrats saying like, I don't trust this CDC, I don't trust this FDA. And it's like, well, who do you think is different in the past? That's a legitimate question. Do we have a different director and scientist at the CDC now than we did 8-9 months ago? Like, I don't think so, but so I think the particularists today are the people who go along with whatever the mainstream. I think if we're going to put a label on it that is easily recognizable, I would say the progressive or establishment Democrats. Increasingly, those are the same in terms of the way power is wielded. But I think from a legislative standpoint, a lot of the proposals right now are around COVID and race. Now, those things are going to clash once the vaccine stuff.
Once you look at the numbers, which these groups tend not to like to look at the numbers because they're always inconvenient for them. But yeah, for sure.
Dude, one of those, as an aside, one of those TikTok videos, those libs of TikTok videos I was telling you about yesterday was they were like singing some song about how because Black communities are over policed, that's why their crime statistics are higher. And because white communities are under policed, that's why their crime statistics are lower. And it was like Sargon Avocado was like, what? Well, we're talking about murder rates here. And they're like, you don't have a big enough sample size. It's like, these are FBI murder rates. Like, the country isn't a big enough sample size of murder. Like is there a disproportion? Is there like a point where if you have enough police in a neighborhood, it just spontaneously bursts out into a riot? Like, what if that's how that logic works? But anyway, but like you said, they don't care about the numbers, and nor will they at any point in time, except for to the degree in which they can serve the narrative. But I think the particularists of today, to bring it back on track, is anyone who checks these boxes of these beliefs, who gets in line with government action. You have to get in line with government action as dictated by someone who is a Democrat. Like, I really think that that's like the simplest possible answer, ideally in favor of some equity, ideally in favor of, getting COVID under control. And so we'll make sure those dregs who are unvaccinated or unmasked, pay the penalty. So, yeah, I mean, that's who I think it is. I don't know, but I think those are the ones who are trying to implement this crap, who are trying to create this planned society. I mean, like you said, that Ayanna Pressley, people can go and try and find it on Twitter, where she was talking to Ibram Kendi. So just two awful human beings having a conversation. It's fantastic.
I thought you were going to say
kind of like whenever Brian Stelter interviews anyone who goes on his show. Yeah. But anyway, that's not true. There's a few people who've given him pushback, but point is that she was like, we want to create this legislation. I mean, Kendi wants to create a department it's a cabinet position of anti-racism. And like I was telling you before,
overrule any, so just to flush that out, can overrule any federal law or local law, state law.
Yep.
And that's like overtly, even the federal laws, probably unconstitutional, definitely unconstitutional against tenets of federalism to go into, the state of Utah and say you can't do this as dictated by the federal government. Not unconstitutional. Totally. It doesn't have to violate the Constitution. That is insane.
Absolutely insane.
Coercive power.
And what it reminded me of, I mean, what I do is I'm like, this is race Marxism, like James Lindsay talked about, this is central planning. It's like that the chapter on economics, where it's like, just let us take care of the economics. Like, that's not going to be a big thing. This is the same shit where they're like, just let us address inequality. Don't you care about racism? Just let us deal with racism. And it's like, no. This is going to impact every single thing. I mean, it is terrifying what they want to do and the amount of power they want to concentrate. So anyway, this exists today. The particularism of today might not be nationalist, but it definitely is racialist, as Hayek alludes to there. So anyway, so let's move on to the next part here, which this is going to be one of a few times that we're going to cite Hoffer, but take it away.
Yeah. So remember, you listening out there, why do the worst get on top? Keep asking yourself that. So this next section, I actually texted Truman as we were reading this, preparing to do the breakdown of this chapter. I'm like, did like Eric Hoffer just like take the pen out of Hayek's hand and start writing the chapter for him? Because this is like so close to his ideas in The True Believer. And if anyone listening to this has not read The True Believer, that's like a couple a day read. It's very short, very to the point, just brilliant. It took me a long time to read it because every few sentences I had to stop and be like, what, like how did this guy get it so spot on? I mean, Hayek does a lot of the same stuff here. But this is a section where there's a massive overlap between Hoffer and Hayek. And that's why we quote both of them, throughout the whole thing. So to jump right into it, quote, "It seems to be almost a law of human nature that it is easier for people to agree on a negative program, on the hatred of an enemy, on the envy of those better off, than on any positive task." It's pretty obvious to us. Well, that's like what social media is built on right now, right? That is exactly that. To continue, the contrast between the we and the they, the common fight against those outside the group, seems to be an essential ingredient in any creed which will solidly knit together a group for common action. I mean, right there, it talks a lot about what we talked about before, but it is pinning the groups against each other. You can do it negatively. Like I said before, those rallying points that those groups have, there tend to be grievance. Why grievance? Because grievance is an inherently negative aspect. It's good to call out people when they're oppressed, but to make your whole platform on oppression and grievance, it's all negative stuff. It's pointing at the other guy and saying, how is this person holding you down? That is CRT. It is asking you to find the negative in every single discrepancy, every single disparity. Everything is looking for the negative, and this is how you build. This is how you build group cohesion in hate. This is how you build a group made of pitchforks and torches.
Yep. So that was Hayek's quote, what Kevin just read. Here's a quote from Eric Hoffer in The True Believer. "Hatred is the most accessible and comprehensive of all unifying agents. Mass movements can rise and spread without belief in a God, but never without belief in a devil." So again, to the question I think Kevin very appropriately posed, why do the worst get on top? What kind of person founds a movement, in-group, out-group movement on hate? Is that a good person? We'll get to some quotes that actually address that. But be thinking about this. Who's going to do that? Here's another quote from Hayek. "The fact that German anti-Semitism and anti-capitalism spring from the same root is of great importance for the understanding of what has happened there. But this is rarely grasped by foreign observers." So let's take that and pair it with a quote maybe from today. I already mentioned this guy. This is going to be like, was that a Candyman movie? You say their name too many times and this monster is going to appear in the mirror. "The origins of racism cannot be separated from the origins of capitalism. The life of capitalism cannot be separated from the life of racism." That's from Ibram X. Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And so the point is that whether it was the demagogues and the racists in Nazi Germany using, okay, it's the Jews, but really it's, the plutocrats, it's capitalism. They would tie the American imperialist and capitalist to the Jews. The Jews were representative of that. Communism did the exact same thing. We see that now today, where Kendi does the same thing. It's the capitalists, capitalism and racism. And this is why I think James Lindsay rightfully points out that this anti-racism, this woke crap is actually the biggest threat to Jews, because they end up lumping them in there with them as well. So the point is that, as Hayek or Hoffer pointed out, you can rise without belief in God, but not without belief in a devil. And Hayek is like, look, it's easier to create a program based on envy and hate. The devil that the socialists attack is capitalism. It is. And so you see then that the collectivist attack is capitalism. And this is where you see, by the way, how damn effective they've been in education, where when you look at the Pew Research on Gen Z and millennials, particularly, greater than 50% disapprove of capitalism, and it's a greater than 50% approve of socialism. And because they've been convinced that this is the enemy, this is where everything comes from. There was again one of those stupid libs of TikTok where they talked about how we shouldn't use the word homeless or houseless or we should say persons displaced by capitalism, as if no one's ever been homeless in a non-capitalist. Like, what about the people who were homeless in Mao's China? Or what about the country, that got rid of homelessness, North Korea, by just killing everyone who didn't have a place or sending them to a camp? So look for the people, and I think I mentioned this at the beginning of the year, and I'll end it here for your thoughts, but, look for the people who are trying to get us to hate and who are trying to rally us around some mutual hatred. What are we seeing in all these op-eds today? It's the unvaccinated. It's the Trump supporting terrorist, unvaccinated dregs that are spreading Delta space AIDS around, that are coalescing around hatred. The rich need to pay their fair share, and let's shit all over Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and whoever, Elon Musk. They need to pay their fair share. There's that hatred and envy of the rich, and the white people who have an ingrained racism. They have to overcome this racism that's part of them, and become an anti-racist, although they can never fully do that. They'll never get rid of their privilege. And so, look for those. What are the devils that we're being told to hate, and just give us the power. Give us the power. Like the right does this too, by the way, with, but usually it's more of a, it's not really give us the power to have total control. It's like, hey, look what they're trying to do. We just won't let them do that thing. Not a bunch of affirmative programs, although in some cases that is the case. But either way, this is how the worst get on top. And this is how you create a system where power begins to be concentrated at the top, because you need to have power to fight those evil people. You need to have power to protect. I want to protect you from these people. Just give us the power. And yeah, whether it's attacking Jews or attacking white people, it's always about capitalism, and it's always about give us power so we can fight them.
Germany made the Jew in the outgroup the evil person because they were the face of capitalism. It's quite literally what they said.
Yep.
And to attack like a group like that, to paint them all like that, I mean, you saw obviously what happened with them. The landowners of the Soviet Union, the same way, the people who had wealth,
Yep.
that had privilege, right? These are used to justify horrible things. And a lot of it doesn't make sense, right? Because everyone utilized capitalism. Everyone has, no one has a privilege in a system where everyone follows under the same rules. You talk about Ibram X. Kendi. If you look into, you got to be anti-racist. You look up the definition he provides of anti-racist is someone who advocates for anti-racist policy. It's like, okay, what's anti-racist policy? Someone who is anti-racist. It's like this dude who is not the brightest bulb in the drawer, I think is the term, is just he creates circular logic, and that's what a lot of people in this type of power do, because they can kind of inject like, oh, you're wrong because you got my definition wrong. It's like, okay, now you give me your definition. It's like, well, no, you're just being a racist because you want me to explain this to you or something like that. It's insane. And like you said, like when you made your comment about pay your fair share, that's this moral basis, right? Like pay your fair share. It's the only moral thing to do. And as you mentioned, like I wrote it down, and you basically said exactly what I was about to say when I was writing it down. It's like, they don't want to improve the conditions of poor people. They hate rich people.
Yep.
It is negative, not positive. And so you cannot possibly expect, if you want this utopia run by good people, you can't expect it to be on the movement of this negative aspect. Good people don't tend to run those movements. Yep. And again, why the worst get on top? This is one of them, although I don't think it needs to be a movement run by bad people to get the worst on top, as we will further explain. But I mean, just how, answer the question as you go through this. It's like, well, it's pretty obvious that if you have a movement built on resentment and hate, that it's probably not going to be run by the best people. Ibram X. Kendi, not a particularly good person. If you read that book, I mean, it is a really morally abhorrent book that goes under the guise of acceptance and inclusiveness and all this stuff and all the buzzwords that come straight out of Orwell's 1984. Those are the red flags you got to throw up. But so Hayek continues to go through how when people get in a large enough group, they kind of shed the moral constraints, the moral bonds that are connected to the individual. And I think it's a really, really good observation as to how, people can do awful things because they're part of a group, and that just makes them feel more comfortable. So Hayek writes, quote, "The desire of the individual to identify himself with the group is very frequently the result of a feeling of inferiority, and that therefore his want will be satisfied only if membership of the group confers some superiority over others. To act on behalf of a group seems to free people of many of the moral restraints which control their behavior as individuals within the group." So this directly goes in line. Again, we're quoting Hayek and Hoffer and Hayek right here. So this goes directly in line with Hoffer wrote in The True Believer, quote, "Unless a man has the talents to make something of himself, freedom is an irksome burden," right? We talked about it. It's a risk and responsibility. It's a burden. It's not something that just comes easy. It's much easier to say, I want the security from the government. It's a lot harder to say, I can make my life better. To continue the quote, "Of what avail is freedom to choose if the self is ineffectual? We join a mass movement to escape individual responsibility, or in the words of the ardent young Nazi, to be free of freedom." Being a part of a group gives the individual the feeling of invincibility against the moral criticisms that will be aimed at him. It's kind of a shield. You can shield yourself from the group. It's kind of the same mechanism that zebras have. They have the stripes so they can hide themselves within the group. That way they cannot be isolated by the predator. But the larger group, the larger the group, the more immoral the act can be. The more powerful the group, the more immoral acts one can act upon those outside of the group, right? So if you have all of Germany saying, it's okay to do these awful things across the board, and I think it's actually a quote we'll get into later, it becomes a lot easier to do those immoral things. You feel like you have more backing behind you. You always feel more comfortable. It's much harder to do things when you're the only one standing there. And that's how a lot of the people feel arguing against, this crazy stuff in schools. You see the videos of one person standing there at a podium saying, "What are you teaching my kids?" That is difficult. That is hard to do. To be in the crowd yelling back at the person, or being on a Zoom call surrounded by all the people, all the woke teachers, the teacher unions being backed by all those people, that stuff's easy. Those comments always tend to be negative. It's hard to be the one person sitting there as an individual having to say, no, this is a problem. It's got to stop.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. The one caveat I would add is, you said being part of a group gives the individual like the feeling of invincibility, or, kind of you can deflect moral criticisms. It's not just being a part of any group. It's being a part of a group that self-characterizes as morally superior to the outgroup. That's how you're able to do that. Like Mennonites probably don't do this, right? And so it's like, it's what kind of group, and we just talked about it, a group that's based on hatred, a group that is literally formed on the basis of resentment and hatred and some, self-imposed or self-declared sense of moral superiority, then has moral license for everyone in the group to act however they want. So it's not just any group, but it's a group that forms along these morally bankrupt parameters. Is that fair enough?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a way to hide yourself within any group, no matter how small or powerless they might be. If you have some wacky idea, if you are a anti-vaxxer, I know we talked about vaccines and stuff, and then, we don't want to have vaccine mandates. That is different than being anti-vax. I'm generally pro-vax in most cases, but to be out there like flat earthers, okay, if I'm one dude out there thinking the earth is flat, I'm much less likely to demand people believe the earth is flat than if I have another person next to me who agrees with me, and then add another person. So it does grow, but certainly one that has the power that you alluded to makes it a lot easier. And not only makes it a
Totally.
lot easier, it allows that individual within the group to really believe in what they say. Because not all the time do these people really believe. A lot of the allies, right, are just along for the ride. But the larger the group is, the more powerful the group is, the easier it is for them to believe in their own BS effectively.
Yeah. I mean, think about the opening scene of Inglorious Bastards with Christoph Waltz in the farm, and he's talking about like, why do you hate rats? Like the rat didn't do anything to you. And he's saying that's how he feels about Jews. He only landed on that conclusion by deciding, or he only landed on that analysis by reaching the conclusion that Jews were the same as rats. And if they're the same as rats, then I can do whatever I want to them, you know? And so just again, why do the worst get on top? And just think about the parallels of today. It's like, well, if someone's spreading these diseases everywhere, if they're killing grandma, if they're putting me at risk, I can do whatever I want to them. Or if they're racist, if they're, you know, some bigot, I can do whatever I want to them. So Hayek kind of, this next section is, I feel like we have these at the end of a lot of chapters where there's something that feels like a little bit out of place, you know, because it gets from a lot of the stuff, you know, we've talked about here is practical, but also philosophical. And this is just a practical, you know, kind of section on math and the scaling of power. And he talks about basically that one of the misconceptions of people who argue for collectivism, and I'll just give the quote here: by concentrating power so that it can be used in the service of a single plan, it is not merely transferred, but infinitely heightened. Concentrating power, infinitely heightened. That by uniting the hands of some single body power, formerly exercised independence by many, an amount of power is created infinitely greater than any that existed before, so much more far-reaching as almost to be different in kind. And so, what he was arguing with here was he was intentionally engaging legitimate arguments by socialists and planners who they're like, look, let's just say we have these 10 companies and they all have this amount of power that doesn't really seem like it's that much power. If the government were to take control of all 10 of those companies, it would be the same. It'd be the same amount of power. You don't feel the effects now of these 10 individual companies exercising their power. So you wouldn't feel the effects there. And what Hayek is saying is that there's a scaling issue here, that when you concentrate all of the power that is, you know, owned by individuals into one thing, then it becomes so far reaching, so much greater, then it's almost different in kind, you know. And, you know, one of the thoughts I had is if you have 100 individuals and they all are exercising their respective power in these different places, you know, the one person who can wield all of those 100 individuals as they want and gets them to do whatever they want has way more power than just the sum total of their individual action. You know, like the Richter scale is, it's not one, you know, was it category 1? I don't know if they use category, but whatever for earthquakes, 1 is, or 2 is not twice as much as 1. It's 10 times more than 1. And 3 is 100 times more than 1. And so there's a scaling issue here that I think that people need to understand. And I think we've honestly talked about that a decent amount in the chapter on the economic issue, or economics and totalitarianism, of like, if it was just, they just took control of one industry of cows and dairy products, like how much more power that would be that they would get to wield on all of these other industries than just the sum total of all of those individual dairy producers. And, you know, I don't know if that covers that sufficiently for you, but it seems that it's, you know, we're trying to not just talk about the book or, you know, our responses, but try to thoroughly cover the contents of the book. And that includes some of these things like this, where he's just engaging an argument. But it's also good to think about today. Honestly, I think, you know, people need to think about that, of like, there is a scaling issue here that probably people don't think about near as much.
Yeah. What's the most powerful company in the world? Amazon, I think, would be a fair response to that, right?
Google, hands down, Google.
Yeah. The Alphabet, I think it is.
Alphabet. Yeah, I would say Alphabet. And
take one of
without
those.
even.
So I'm not even talking about an entire industry. I'm just talking about like one company. They have a lot of power.
Google.
Man,
Google,
I would actually argue that they have more power than the government. I would argue that.
Easily. Oh, yeah.
I would argue that. Is the appropriate response to that to make it a government-run company? Does that increase power? Does that decrease power? What happens to the power dynamics? Does it go down? Does it go up? Is it twice as much? Is it like you talked about, a scale factor as much? And to be fair, like there's conservatives arguing for something. To be fair, there's conservatives arguing this type of policy. in a way. Like it's normally not that this government runs Amazon, government runs Alphabet, but just think about it that way. Just this enormously powerful than the most powerful government in the world. What would happen if that most powerful government took it over?
Yep.
It would be the amount of power it would be able to, and that's the problem now, is they're kind of already taking it over using their coercive powers, and the idea of not a monopoly but the cartel that they're bounding themselves together is scary, but the appropriate response to correct some sort of private sector injustice is not to make it a public sector, is the main point here. That's the opposite direction in which you want to go. So I do think this actually applies pretty well into today, for sure.
Totally. And it's not just the power, but it's like the way in which it would be wielded becomes different. And that's why he says it's different in kind. Right. Like if the government took over Google is what, 99% of the information stream that people receive on the internet. And the government now that is literally one step. Oh, hey, we're China now. In China, it's Baidu. The government runs Baidu. That's it. That's it. And so now you have a government curated information stream.
We're all going to be on Ask Jeeves shortly after, I'm sure, if it's still around.
Whenever I was in 5th grade, there was a search engine. No, this was later. This is actually maybe 6th or 7th grade. There was a search engine called ThoughtBot that we had to use, and I was in science class, and I was like, what's it called? Hot butt. And so I went into hotbutt.com. Like, you said hot butt, right?
I just picture if this is a major tangent. If it's get taken over by the government, we'd all be Stuart going on the dark web because we'd have to get away from Google. That would be exactly what all of us are doing. Yep. But yeah, it's you don't solve a problem by creating a larger problem, is basically the lesson of this section. But now we get into kind of the home stretch here. Again, asking yourself, why do the worst get on top? Well, the government taking over Amazon or Google, the worst could get on top, and the worst will be super effective. But this is the part where you really, if you don't believe it now, if you cannot answer the question why the worst gets on top right now, you're going to be able to answer it in the next 10 15 minutes, I think. So I'm going to start quoting him here. Quote, "The principle that the ends justify the means is in individualist ethics regarded as a denial of all morals," right? It's not moral to say the ends justify the means, because some horrible things can happen. But in collectivist ethics, it becomes necessarily the supreme rule. The ends justify the means in collectivist ethics becomes necessarily the supreme rule. There is literally nothing which the consistent collectivist must not be prepared to do if it serves the good of the whole, because the good of the whole is to him the only criterion of what ought to be done. Now we're starting to piece everything together. First step is a large enough group creates the need for action on the general moral basis, right? Moral basis. Yep. Second, a system that concentrates this power is implemented. Take it away from the boards, put it into the government, right? And third, the moral basis is used to justify immoral results. The ends justify the means becomes the supreme rule here. The supreme rule.
Yep.
Yeah, you can give your comments on that real fast.
I mean, it's just, and we see this here today, and I don't want to rehash stuff that we've talked about whenever it comes to COVID or anything like that. But I mean, this ends justify the means is like something that this is their argument. I mean, that was the thing. I think it was in the London Times where it said, we need Big Brother to end the pandemic. I think they said, don't let the civil liberties lobby distract from the fact that we need Big Brother to end the pandemic. And that includes mandates and passports. It's like, that's crazy. But if the ends are the only thing that matters, then you can do whatever you want. And again, this is so important. This is a feature. If you don't whatever arguments you want to make about the right, even as they stand today, traditional conservatism has some principles of limited government, individual rights, respect for the individual. Like you talked about earlier, how it's a feature, not a bug, for it to be very slow to implement government, change or government force unless it's necessary. Obviously, we have some notable exceptions, but again, George W. Bush wasn't a conservative, but the Patriot Act would be a huge exception to that. But the idea of just argue for the ends. That's Ayanna Pressley talking about, well, we just want to we got to fight racism. So what does it matter what we do? What does it matter? We got to get rid of COVID. What does it matter what we do? We want to fight income inequality, or we want to, gosh, the crap that they've done in California, where just make it legal for people to just steal shit under $950 because we don't want to oppress whatever nonsense, or, we don't want to worry about petty crime. These are crimes of necessity, right? We don't want to do anything to harm the homeless. So we're just going to continue to give them needles until we have to hire people to actually just clean up feces and needles off the street. That is their job in San Francisco. It's like, whenever you don't have any grounded principles, no moral principles other than just the end, whatever the ends are, it doesn't matter. Like, the means irrelevant. We can just state these ends that are, make us sound good. Then there is some we care about inclusion, so we're going to implement segregation on college campuses. That's crazy. But if you don't have a founding principle of, hey, segregation is evil, regardless of what I say the reason that I want to implement it is, then you're going to do these things because they're totally unmoored from any principles.
Yeah, it's 100% accurate. So we have another part that really hammers this home. And I added an extra section of quotes onto it between when we talked about this last night and talked about it today, because honestly, when we were listening, so our process here is we will actually listen to the audiobook together. We'll take notes together to figure out, what's the best quotes to pull out, the best ideas to pull out from every chapter. There's a section in here that actually kind of elicited an emotional response out of me, that it's like, wow, this is horrifying. And we all need to understand that. And that, you'll understand the end, why this is horrifying, and why the worst get on top when you realize the atrocities that are okay under the supreme rule of the ends justify the means. Quote, once you admit that the individual is merely a means to serve the ends of a higher entity called society or the nation, most of those features of totalitarian regimes which horrify us follow of necessity. It has to come. It's inevitable. It will be coming. And this is where we get the horrors of the 20th century that creeps in. Horrors that came during Hayek's time writing this book, and the horrors that came after it, after writing the book. And so here's an additional quote here. It is inevitable that occasionally cruelty might become a duty, that acts which revolt all of our feeling, such as shooting of hostages, the killing of the old and sick, should be treated as mere matters of expediency, that the compulsory uprooting of the transportation of hundreds of thousands should become an instrument of policy approved by almost everybody except the victims, or that suggestions like that of the conscription of women for breeding purposes can be seriously considered. We're talking about the wives' tale. What is it called?
Handmaid's Tale.
The Handmaid's Tale. Yeah. I mean, that's the future, that you can envision there, and all the horrible things that will come from a large coercive power. But it's not only are the means like this considered pure evil by the liberal observer, although not considered by the person acting upon those means at the time, but it's also that this attracts the bad men.
Yep.
You have to have someone, when he says that cruelty may occasionally become duty, that duty needs to be taken up by someone. The first person to raise their hand and say, I'll do it. Yep. You think that's going to be the good guy? You think that's going to be the church going fella who's, like, oh man, I don't like doing this, but I guess I will if I'll be the first one. No, it's the psychopath who is like, I threw my cat in a fire the other day. I might as well do this, right? Like
Yep.
it's truly horrible people that will come to the top. So not only is it corrupting the bad people or corrupting the good people, which when the good people see this cruelty becoming a duty, the bad people that's doing it first, they will eventually follow because they are told that it's the right thing to do. So now you're
Yep.
corrupting the good people. What is the bad people who run in head first saying like, yeah, I'm your guy. I'll do this. Cruelty is a duty. I'm fine with that.
Here, oh boy, here I go killing again. Yeah, I mean, there's two things here that we have analogs for this today. I have heard people legitimately argue the point that maybe it's just better if we just let the old people who are in charge of certain things just die off, so because they have all these outdated views and morals. And then I've also, I mean, look at how I'm seeing these. So I don't have a lot of exposure to political cartoons because I don't have a newspaper subscription anywhere. But whenever I see these on Twitter, a lot of these are passed around by lefties. Like yesterday, like DeSantis variant was trending on Twitter because people are stupid. But look at the political cartoons of people who it's like making it's obviously conservatives. They usually are wearing like a red hat, who are like in the hospital because of COVID, or they're, one of them said like it was like they were drowning, and it's like vaccines, vaccines are trying to help them out of drowning in the ocean. It's, I'm not a sheep. Or there's a person with a ventilator on. It's like, I'm not going to, or they're wearing a shirt and red hat, it says, I won't put something over my mouth. And, just look at the way or even if any person who dies or gets COVID is treated in the news articles, is like, oh, this person made a joke about COVID. Now they're in the hospital. And the comments are always abhorrent, where they're like, yeah, they just need to die. This is what they get. Let them die. These plague bearers. And so we're already seeing that dehumanizing thing in a lot of ways, where it's like, oh, if you don't agree with me, then, just let you die off. Like, you're just, society's better off without you. Not that I should consider what you say. And to the point of where you said, like, the person who will say, I do it, there's this quote that Hayek includes from an American economist named Frank H. Knight. He says, they would have to do these things whether they wanted to or not. So he's talking about this, like, what does he say up here? Cruelty will become a duty. So Knight is saying they would have to do these things whether they wanted to or not. And the probability of the people in power being individuals who would dislike the possession and exercise of power is on a level with the probability that an extremely tender-hearted person would get the job of whipping master in a slave plantation. And so the point is what I quoted at the very beginning of, they will have to choose between failure or just throwing their morals out the window. And most socialists would be like, actually, I'm not on board with that. Then that creates this vacuum. And again, it ain't going to be the tender-hearted person who's willing to do those things.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that was like a perfect summation of that quote by Knight there. Of like, the problem is when people ask, why does it seem like the bad people always get on top of these systems? It's because it's the only logical conclusion. It is it. That is the only thing. And it's that dumb saying, or, well, it's not a dumb saying, it's a good saying, but it's treating a person who's dumb as they should. It's like, if you keep doing the same thing, you're gonna get the same results. Doesn't matter if you slightly tweak the system, doesn't matter if you change the people. This is the inevitable conclusion. Why would it be any other way? Why are you going to expect a different result using a system that will use any means necessary to get to its goals? Why would it produce anything different? Why would it take another, human being? Hayek talks a lot about the Germans did the bad things they did, not because they were German, but because of the projection of where they were headed away from liberalism and down the road to servitude, down the road to serfdom. It isn't the people. It isn't good people starting out. It isn't bad people. It's not the intentions that start out. It's not the moral basis. It's the immoral results you're seeing. And this is the only logical conclusion. You ask yourself the question, it's like, because it happens, because it makes sense. When you fully think out these ideas, it always comes to, oh, duh, right? This is common sense here, ironically. We don't have to talk about it as common sense because it's actually common. Once you actually think through the ideas, it makes sense. It takes a lot of digging, right? It's the idea that, all shallows are clear. Like if you use shallow thinking, it always seems to make sense. But when you dig a little bit deeper, it's like, wow, that thing that made sense a little bit ago makes absolutely no sense now. When they say the system just needs to be run by good people, it's like, well, it's shallow thinking. That makes sense. If good people run it, then good things will happen, right? No, it's the system itself. It's the concentration of power itself. It's the coercion over the people that incentivize all of these bad actors to come in, and that changes the people. The little bit of good people who are left is, we've said 100 times before, they either step in line with the bad people or they get shot in the back of the head. That is the only logical conclusion.
Yeah, and it makes me think of, you can look at just look at the people that Bernie Sanders supported over the last 3 decades in other countries and what the outcomes. Like, look at the people who supported the Castros. He supported Bolsonaro, and I think that was Brazil, I believe. Who was it? Who was in charge in Venezuela? What was the name of that? That wasn't Chavez, was it? Who's the guy who was in Venezuela?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
And who implemented all this? Like, they praised all of these people as they're the ones. They are good people, and then these horrible outcomes happen. I referenced this yesterday in our Ember conversation of where James Lindsay read that letter of support, or that statement of support to Angela Davis, who's a CRT person who influenced Ibram Kendi a lot and a lot of the stuff today, that she read in support of Jim Jones in Jonestown in Guyana, where I think it was over 1,000 people died. And when we were talking about this last night, I keep coming back to this notion. And I remember I did a video about this, where just this thought popped into my head after the election, but I just keep coming back to just the hubris and the lack of humility that is required to hold this worldview. Like you said, are the people who say, well, we'll just put good people in charge. Don't you see? And disregard all of human history and human nature and all of the examples of when they were wrong, because they're so ardently committed to the rightness of their views that they just don't care. And it made me think of that scene in Jurassic Park when they get back to dinner, and it's Ian Malcolm and Dr. Sadler and Dr. Grant who are sitting around the dinner table, and they're giving John Hammond their take on what they just saw at the park. And I kind of synthesized what Malcolm said here in this quote, because I think this just encapsulates all of it to me. Again, I changed it just a little bit so it makes some more sense here, but he says the lack of humility before nature that's being displayed here staggers me. Don't you see the danger inherent in what you're doing here? You have a power that is the most awesome force the planet's ever seen, but you wield it like a kid that's found his dad's gun. If I may, I'll tell you the problem with the power that you're using here. It didn't require any discipline to attain it. You didn't earn the knowledge for yourselves, so you don't take any responsibility for it. You stood on the shoulders of geniuses to accomplish something as fast as possible, and you're so preoccupied with whether or not you could that you didn't stop to think if you should. And that, to me, just summarizes the blind arrogance of the people who advocate for these ideas, who will say, we'll just create a thing of Department of Anti-Racism. By the way, I think Ayanna Pressley and Ibram Kendi know damn well what will happen with those things. It's the morons on the ground who are like, yeah, no, they're good people. Well, we'll put them in charge. It's so arrogant. It is so arrogant to think we'll get absolute power right this time. We'll get total control of society right this time. And Malcolm says this lack of humility before nature. Obviously, in the quote, he's referencing, nature as in the natural world. But there's this lack of humility before history and human nature and everything that we've seen throughout all of history. Again, they even have recent examples of where they were like, oh, yeah, here it'll work here. Oh, shit, maybe not. And
current examples.
Exactly. Yeah, current
examples.
Some of those, dude, no bullshit. On one of those like libs of TikTok video, they literally say the only reason we think that North Korea is communist is because of American propaganda. It's like they say that about themselves. What are you talking about? But they literally, there are videos that have thousands and thousands of views and likes where they say North Korea is actually a good model to follow. The arrogance and the ignorance required to hold that viewpoint is right. Malcolm says it right there. It staggers me. It staggers me to think to Lord Acton, we'll get absolute power right this time. How could you possibly have that? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what your intentions are. It doesn't matter how compassionate you sound or how rousing the rhetoric or how well-intentioned the goals sound like. It doesn't matter. The person who says, trust me with absolute power is the last person you can trust with absolute power, period. End of story. That's it. But this is what we're seeing today. And these people are gaining ascendancy, this ideology of get rid of the filibuster, get rid of any of the democratic norms, anything that mandates or facilitates consensus and compromise. Get rid of it. Get rid of it. It's just to absolute power. And it scares the shit out of me and it pisses me off because it's just so damn arrogant. And it's like, it's one thing, this last thing I'll say, I've mentioned this quote multiple times, heard it all the time growing up. It was some people can be told and that's good enough. Some people can see for themselves and then they'll believe you, but the rest just have to piss on the electric fence themselves. And that's what these people are doing, where it's like, they just have to experience, the absolute destruction of freedom in order to believe it. And it would be one thing if it was just them. It would be one thing if it was just them. Like, go beta test this somewhere, or go to North Korea and tell me if it's go take notes. In fact, we want to try that out. So please go to North Korea and get as comprehensive notes as possible and experience it for yourself. But they're bringing us along with them on this reckless experiment of just gambling with the freedom and the system we have here. And it terrifies me and it just pisses me off, man, because they're going to destroy it for all of us.
Yeah, this just reminds me of the conversation, the Ember conversation. For those of you who don't know about that, Ember is a think tank that we Truman and I participate in with Carlin Bursinko and James Darian of Commutation Construct. And I think that conversation will get released the Saturday after we release this conversation. But one of the things we talked about there was comedy, the load-bearing structure of comedy. And it's such a profound truth-telling mechanism is why comedy is so important. And I think a lot of the talk about these atrocities in the past, you don't read as much about them in books as you probably ought to. You definitely don't learn about them in class as you ought to, because it doesn't fit their narrative. You can get them on places like this, get them on some podcasts for the people who are willing to talk about them at the risk of their own, public image. Comedy is the place where you can get a lot of this information. You make fun of it. And I don't think it's any coincidence that when you and I do this review stuff, for any of you guys who have not understood the jokes we've been going back and forth, it's from Letterkenny, a terrific show. So, when we laugh at random stuff or make a joke, a lot of times just from comedy and stuff, we're talking about back and forth, we're listening to roasts and stuff like that. But it's important because when you learn about this stuff, when you talk about this stuff, if you don't laugh, you will fucking cry.
Yep.
This is devastating stuff. And I cannot oversell it enough that we need to pay attention to these red flags. We need to understand the worst get on top, because it's very simple when you think it through.
Yep.
The people who want us, you talk about North Korea, it's actually called the Republic of North Korea. And you can tell every country in the world that has the Republic of in front of it, which includes China, includes at least one place in Africa.
Congo, DPR.
Yeah.
Yep. Or not yet.
They do it. Congo, yeah. They're not republics at all. They do it to advertise to the West saying we're not that bad.
Yeah.
We're not that bad. And people grab onto that, and people will use that as a talking point, saying, well, they're not that bad. It's American propaganda. It's, don't worry about collectivism. It's bad people running it, bad people. It's easy to point out the bad people throughout history. Stalin, Hitler, Mao, the list goes on, because those are the scapegoats for those systems is the problem.
Yep. They
don't identify the system. Or, if it's identified as communism, they'll try to rebrand it, say it hasn't been tried. And that's the wool over your eyes, trying to make you blind to what's actually happening.
They'll call it state capitalism. That's what the socialists actually call it, is state capitalism. They'll say Marx or the USSR was state capitalism. And if you want to look at the difference of how society has changed, when the stories of the Holocaust first came out, people didn't believe it. They didn't believe it. But when they realized they were true, that mobilized people. It's not that people don't believe what's going on in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs. People believe it. They just don't care. They just don't care. And that same group of people, again, it's mostly people on the right who are saying this is a problem. What has happened to the moral framework of this is a very broad statement. Take it with a lot of salt. But what has happened to the moral framework of the left? And again, that's where a lot of these ideas are coming from, to where they're dehumanizing people. You aren't vaccinated. I mean, look at the tweets, look at text message screenshots, look at the articles. They're unvaccinated or they're racist. They won't wear a mask or whatever. That those are the same people that are very indifferent to what's going on in Xinjiang, to the Uyghurs. And that's not across the board. There are a lot of people on the left who are rightfully upset about it. But that dehumanizing process has already begun. It has already begun. And it, like you said, if you don't laugh, you're going to cry, because it's when you realize the logical conclusion of this stuff, if we don't stop it, it breaks you. It breaks you. So it's like that's why we have to fight this. We have to fight it.
Yeah. Yeah. No one believed the Soviet Union until the Gulag Archipelago came out. And even then it had a tremendous pushback when it first came out too.
Well, when what's his name came out there and said, yeah, everything Stalin did was it Khrushchev? Was it Khrushchev who came out and said everything you heard was right, but it's okay, I'm better. Was that Khrushchev? I can't remember who.
From the book.
No, in the USSR, there was the person who said everything you heard was right.
Well, there was an example in the book that we covered in a previous chapter of a guy who was very sympathetic toward communism, spent a couple of years there or something like that, and came back like, nope, it's horrible.
No, this was, I think, in the 60s or 70s.
Oh, okay.
It might have been, it wasn't Gorbachev. Anyway, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay. All right. So let's start moving that way.
Yeah. So there's a good quote at the end of this chapter that really transition us well into the next chapter. I'm not covering it now, but this next chapter is probably going to be the biggest chapter of them all, in terms of actually, ironically, the shortest chapter in the book, I think, but it is going to be something that we're going to have to cover very, very thoroughly. So the next chapter is called The End of Truth. And it's very appropriately titled because the relationship between reality and the truth begins to skew once you no longer share a moral system. When the ends justify the means, you don't really have to believe in truth, or truth is the truth is only what the coercive power makes it to be, effectively. So to end it here, quote, "The problem of the selection of leaders is closely bound with the wide problem of selection according to the opinions held, or rather according to the readiness with which a person conforms to an ever-changing set of doctrines. And this leads us to one of the most characteristic moral features of totalitarianism, its relationship to and its effect on all the virtues falling under the general heading of truthfulness." Basically right there, truth takes a backseat in the pursuit of power. Truth, it often is a weapon of the less powerful toward the powerful, right?
Yep.
We talked about in the conversation yesterday with comedy. Comedy is a profound truth-telling mechanism, which is why an authoritarian power and a coercive authority needs to take out comedy, right? The court jester is the only one who can speak the truth in the king's court. The relationship with truth, the truth needs to effectively end if this coercive power is to fully take hold and be able to actually control and meet its end goals.
Yeah, it's an extension of, but an important extension that's worth getting into the details of just abandoning morals, of just abandoning all that's right, all that's good, and so yeah, the next chapter is one that I'm very. It's funny that it's chapter 11, which is also the thing for bankruptcy, and it's like the end of truth is a morally bankrupt society. So I thought that was kind of funny, but
yeah. So I think we can get into the summary of chapter 10 now. Why the worst get on top again. I like the idea of us repeating, what should the audience be thinking throughout the whole thing. And I really hope that helped you guys listening help, understand where the material was going and really what Hayek wanted to say and oftentimes what Hoffer wanted to say. So I think it was an awesome chapter overall. But the first takeaway we have is that many people believe that failed governments is a result of bad people coming to power. They don't believe it's a problem with the system, or at least they believe that any system could work if managed by good people. But as Lord Acton said right at the beginning, it's the concentration of power a system gathers that corrupts good people and attracts bad people.
Yeah, and just another distinction between these systems is that, it's one thing to talk about the moral basis of a system. Another way you can phrase that in your mind is, what are your goals? What are your hoped for results? What are your aspirations? What are your intentions? And it's another thing entirely to talk about the moral results of a system. And those goals are not always the same as the outcomes. So the moral basis, you could have very high-minded goals, as we just talked about, different places that had very high-minded goals of creating this morally good and morally just system, but the moral outcomes were devastating. They were absolutely appalling and defied all human sensibilities of right and wrong, because again, this is about the system. The moral basis is irrelevant to the incentives it creates and what the outcomes of it are.
Exactly. And then we also, a major talking point here is around the word particularist or particularism, that collectivism inevitably becomes particularist. A collectivist mass movement needs something to rally behind, and that something is typically a grievance toward another group, giving the group in power all the moral justification they need to do horrible things to the people who are in the out group.
Yep. And again, not to beat a dead horse, but we might have a few examples of that today. And so then, again, to end it, the worst get on top when the ends justify the means. And so those ends could be taking care of those dregs you just mentioned and the outgroup and dealing with that threat, or it could be the ends of achieving a just and equitable society, but either way, when that becomes the supreme rule, then that's how the worst get on top, because it's the only logical conclusion because of all of the aforementioned, factors that this type of centrally planned and concentrated power, system creates.
Exactly. So like we said, this next chapter is going to be a big one, but we actually might be doing something different between this chapter and the next chapter. We still haven't landed on exactly what we're going to do, but our idea right now is to do some sort of live stream for those of you who are listening to this, to, participate, ask your questions about what has happened in the previous, the first 10 chapters in the introduction, and to, get our thoughts or even maybe make suggestions as to how we should cover the next few chapters. Sure. As well. So I think, that'll be a great opportunity. We don't know exactly where we're going to be hosting it. We have a couple ideas as to where we'll be hosting the live stream. But we'll just let you know that possibly next Monday, we might be doing something a little bit different. So you might see chapter 11, which is going to be the biggest one. It might come the following week.
Yep. Yeah, that's it. I don't think I have any other thoughts. Do you, Kevin?
Nope. No, man. We appreciate you guys listening. This is, I think, episode 9. So we've had 8 previous to this. Every Monday they come out. We've been pretty good at keeping up on our Mondays. So I'm proud of us, boys.
Right.
So
good job, boys.
Right. So you can find this on my channel. You can also find this on Truman's channel, but you can find Truman on YouTube by searching Return to Reason, on ThinkSpot, searching Return to Reason, go on Medium for written content. You can also find him and follow him on Twitter at My Mundane Mind, but the best place to get him and support him is definitely gonna be on Locals by going to returntoreason.locals.com.
That is correct. I'll tell you, there's another YouTube channel someone recently started called Return to Reason. And I hate that. I hate that very much.
We'll get alert.
That's right. So anyway, so with Kevin, which I don't think there is a competing name, at least that I'm aware of, maybe on LinkedIn, but Kevin Engineering Politics on YouTube, ENG_politics on Twitter, engineeringpolitics.locals.com. Is that right? It's a full phrase. That's what I thought. And then same on Medium and ThinkSpot. Kevin actually updates his ThinkSpot, which I need to be better about. and you can check all of his stuff out there. So I think with that in mind, thank you for watching, everyone. Is Kevin, did I leave something out?
No, perfect, man.
All right. Thanks for watching, and we'll check you later. Peace.
See ya.